That face has been staring at something for 300,000 years, and you still don't know what it saw. You're crouching over your father's body, pressing your palm flat against his chest, and the silence underneath your hand is the loudest thing you've ever felt. He looks like he's sleeping. He has looked like he's sleeping for 3 days. You know, somewhere in your gut before your mind catches up, that this is not sleeping. Then a thought detonates. Not a feeling. A thought. Clean and cold and aimed directly at you. That is going to happen to me. You stand up. Somewhere nearby, a young man named Tusk is watching you go, head tilted, already poking at the question you just left behind. Here is what we need to know. At what exact moment did a human brain first understand that death was coming for it personally? And what did that brain do next? Because the answer doesn't just tell you about Neanderthals or burial rites or old bones in the dirt. It tells you why you make things, why you pray, and why some part of you still refuses, against all evidence, to believe you will ever actually end. Mortality salience onset. That's the moment a child's brain stops treating death as something that happens to fish and grandparents and starts treating it as something that will happen to them. It matters because most of us assume someone sat a child down and explained the bad news. The knowledge assembles itself anyway, uninvited, the way a thunderstorm assembles itself, out of conditions that were always present. Jesse Bering at the University of Otago ran a set of experiments published around 2006 in which children as young as 4 and 5 were already forming working concepts of their own mortality. Not full ones, not tidy ones, but real ones. The kind that produce the question you are not ready for at bedtime. A 4-year-old asking whether you will die is not performing depth. They mean it. And somewhere in the asking, they already know the answer applies to them too. The full picture takes a few more years to click into place. Virginia Slaughter at the University of Queensland compiled studies showing that most children reach what researchers call a mature death concept, understanding that death is universal, inevitable, and irreversible by age 7. 3 properties, 1 brutal package, assembled inside a mind that also still believes in the tooth fairy, which is honestly impressive multitasking. Universality means everyone dies. Inevitability means no one escapes. Irreversibility is the one that lands hardest because children test it. They ask whether the dog is still sleeping, whether grandma could wake up if you called her name loudly enough. By 7, most children have stopped testing. They know. What this means is that death awareness is not a cultural download. No single conversation installs it. The developing brain builds the concept the way it builds object permanence, through accumulating small collisions with reality until the model locks. You did not learn to find death frightening the way you learned the alphabet. The dread assembled itself inside you, quietly, between ages 4 and 7, and it has been running in the background ever since. That is not a comfortable thought. It is, however, a checkable one. The studies exist, the ages are consistent across cultures, and the mechanism appears to be species-wide, which raises the obvious next question, the one that sends you sideways into deep time and the inside of other skulls entirely. And that question lives in the next chapter, the time machine in your skull, where we ask whether ancient cousins who never wrote a word might have felt exactly what you felt at age 6, staring at the ceiling in the dark. You wake up this morning already doing it, without trying, without knowing. Before your feet hit the floor, you have probably run a quiet movie of your day. The meeting, the errand, the version of yourself who gets home tired. And that small, unremarkable act of imagination is, according to Thomas Suddendorf and Michael Corballis, the most dangerous cognitive trick evolution ever handed a primate. Their 1997 cognitive threshold hypothesis argues that mental time travel, the ability to project yourself forward into a future moment, to inhabit a self that does not yet exist, is the actual prerequisite for death awareness, not big brains in general. This specific trick. Think about what that means. A dog does not lie awake dreading its own funeral. A crow can solve a puzzle box, but almost certainly cannot picture itself, old and stiff, failing to open one. The death-fearing brain is not smarter exactly. It is just cursed with a longer view. To know you will die, Suddendorf and Corballis suggest, you must first be able to mentally stand in a future moment and look back at the present you. A hominin who cannot project forward cannot dread what forward contains. Lucky them, honestly. Here is the status flip that should make you sit down. You might assume that awareness of death is the heavy burden evolution added on top of an otherwise fine brain. The counterintuitive reversal is that death awareness is not the cost of the upgrade. It is the receipt. The moment a mind crosses the mental time travel threshold, terror arrives not as a side effect, but as the immediate, automatic, first-day delivery. You do not get future planning, and then later, sadly, get mortality. You get them in the same breath. They came bundled. Suddendorf and Corbalis put that threshold somewhere in the hominin lineage before modern Homo sapiens, but could not pin a date with confidence. And nobody sensible has pinned it since, which is honest of them. The skull does not fossilize in a way that shows you when foresight switched on. What we can say is that once the switch flipped, the brain that could imagine Tuesday could also imagine no more Tuesdays. Somewhere, a hominin glanced at the still surface of a waterhole, saw a face looking back, and thought, quietly, with great reverence, the long sleep. And then, immediately, furiously, went back to scraping a hide, because the hide was right there and the thought was not. Once evolution handed that hominin a future-projecting brain, what did it immediately do with the terror that came with it? That question is where we go now, into grief without words. So here is the obvious objection. If a chimpanzee carries her dead infant for weeks, isn't she just confused, not grieving? Maybe the attachment system simply hasn't received the shutdown signal yet, like a phone call where nobody hangs up. That reading is tidy, and it might even be partially right. But Dora Biro's 2010 fieldwork at Bossou, Guinea, documented multiple chimpanzee mothers doing exactly this, carrying dead infants for up to 68 days, and the behavior is far too costly, too prolonged, and too widespread to dismiss as a glitch. Something is happening. We just can't be certain what. This is where proto-thanatological behavior enters, which is the unwieldy scientific term for doing grief-shaped things before you have a word, a concept, or possibly a clue about what death actually is. It matters enormously because if grief precedes language, it also precedes us, and that rewrites the story of what kind of thing mourning is. It isn't a cultural invention. It is something evolution kept handing forward, like a note nobody asked to carry. Elephants make the case even harder to dismiss. At Cynthia Moss's Amboseli Elephant Research Project in Kenya, researchers have watched elephants return to the bones of dead companions, touching skulls with their trunks, standing in what looks uncomfortably like silence. They show clear interest in elephant bones specifically, not zebra bones, not any old interesting object lying around. That selective attention is striking. Tusk, for his part, would have taken one look at those bones, whispered, "The long sleep," and immediately started dragging a branch somewhere with great urgency, because the branch needed dragging and the bones did not need thinking about. Here is the honest line, though. Grief-like behavior is not the same as a death concept. A chimpanzee carrying her infant and an elephant touching a skull are both doing something real and something ancient. Neither one is necessarily picturing their own future absence from the world. The behavior might be the raw material, the emotional precursor, out of which genuine death comprehension eventually gets built. Or it might be a parallel track that never converges. Grief may be older than language, older than humanity itself, but grief is not the same as knowing death is coming specifically for you, with your name on it, on a date you cannot see. So where exactly does emotional response end and genuine death comprehension begin? And can bones tell us, which is the question waiting inside the pit of bones? So grief without comprehension is the strange part. Grief alone doesn't prove the mind behind it understood what it was mourning. That distinction matters enormously, because somewhere between feeling the loss and planning for it, a threshold gets crossed, and crossed means traceable in the ground. Around 430,000 years ago, deep inside a cave system at Atapuerca in northern Spain, a shaft in the rock holds the bones of at least 28 Homo heidelbergensis individuals, all tipped into the dark below. Paleoanthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga named it the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, and his team's interpretation is that these bodies were carried there and dropped in deliberately, disposed of with intent. The deliberate disposal hypothesis doesn't require tenderness. It just requires a decision. This body goes there, which is, cognitively speaking, a staggering sentence to construct 500,000 years ago. Somewhere, presumably, a Homo heidelbergensis glanced at the pit, felt something, and immediately went back to scraping a hide, which is honestly a coping strategy that would hold up today. The case doesn't rest there. In 2023, Lee Berger and his team announced that Homo naledi, a small-brained, small-bodied hominin, had left body-like deposits in a cave system at Rising Star in South Africa. In passages dated to somewhere between 250,000 and 335,000 years ago, Naledi's brain was roughly a third the size of yours. The deliberate disposal hypothesis applied here means that intentional treatment of the dead predates the big-brained hominins we typically credit with symbolic thought. Tusk's reaction, upon hearing this, is reportedly one slow blink and the word smaller. What both sites share is a gesture toward meaning, not just removal of a body, but placement. The difference between dumping and depositing is, apparently, everything. It is the gap between a mind that registered a problem and a mind that understood that the problem would, in time, also be its problem. That is the earliest traceable signature of death comprehension. Not art, not language, not a ceremony with flowers. Just a body moved deliberately to a specific location, at a cost in effort that only makes sense if something felt owed to the dead. Wherever that threshold sits, both Atapuerca and Rising Star push it back further than we were comfortable admitting. And if bodies were being placed deliberately that far back, what cognitive machinery had to already be humming in the dark? Which is precisely the question cracked open by the Neanderthals of Shanidar Cave and the flowers someone may or may not have left for the dead. So if the flowers were planted by rodents, does any of this hold up? Yes, and the honest answer is that the wobble in the evidence is itself the story worth telling. Here is why it matters. Around 60,000 years ago at Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, Neanderthals were apparently doing something with their dead that looked, from the outside, a great deal like grief. Ralph Solecki, excavating for Columbia University between 1957 and 1961, uncovered at least 10 individuals whose body positions suggested deliberate placement rather than casual abandonment. That alone was enough to rattle the comfortable story of Neanderthals as purely reactive creatures, one muscle twitch ahead of the aurochs. Then, in 1975, palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan analyzed soil from around Shanidar 4 and found dense clusters of pollen from at least 8 flowering plant species: yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, arranged in a pattern that looked less like wind scatter and more like a bouquet. The interpretation landed like a small bomb. Neanderthals brought flowers to a grave. They mourned. They were, in some measurable chemical sense, us. Then Jeffrey Summer, in 1999, pointed at the Persian jerd, a burrowing rodent still common in that region, and noted that these animals habitually cache flower heads underground in exactly the dense clusters Leroy-Gourhan had measured. The ritual displacement controversy, which is the formal name for this ongoing argument, had arrived. Science, as Summer's paper gently implied, is not immune to the wishful thinking Ernest Becker warned us about. We want Neanderthals to have mourned because it makes our own mourning feel less accidental. What this means is thornier than either side admits. If the flowers were deliberate, Neanderthals were projecting meaning onto death roughly 60,000 years before the oldest known written eulogy. If the flowers were rodent pantries, we still have 10 carefully placed bodies, and placement is not nothing. A Persian jerd does not arrange a corpse. Our hunger to find grief in deep time is so strong we may have dressed a rodent's larder in human feeling, or, just as likely, we stumbled onto something real and then lost our nerve. Picture a Neanderthal pausing over a still pool at Shanidar, seeing something unrecognizable stare back, whispering, the long sleep, and then immediately, furiously, going back to scraping a hide, because the hide is there and the thought is not survivable. Maybe that is projection, maybe that is recognition, but if Neanderthals were already making symbols tens of thousands of years before any burial dispute, does the flower question even matter? Which is the uncomfortable ground we walk into with symbols before graves. You are standing in a cave in northern Spain, pressing your hand against cold limestone, and whatever made the marks already here was not you. That fact should bother you more than it does. The red ladder shapes on the walls of La Pasiega Cave in Cantabria were uranium series dated by Dirk Hoffman and colleagues in a 2018 science paper to at least 65,000 years ago. A full 20,000 years before modern humans reached Europe. Neanderthals made them. The mind that looked at a rock wall and thought, I will put something there, that means something was not the mind we have been quietly assuming held the patent on that move. Antecedent symbolic cognition is the technical term, which is science's way of saying the spark arrived before we thought it did in a skull we did not expect to hold it. And it was not only Neanderthals running ahead of schedule. Curtis Marian's team at Arizona State University reported in 2007 that people at Pinnacle Point, South Africa, were grinding and using ochre around 164,000 years ago, nearly twice as far back as the oldest uncontested burial we have argued about in previous chapters. Ochre is not food. Ochre is not a tool. Ochre is the color you choose when you want something to mean. Somewhere near the South African coast, a small group picked up red pigment and made a decision no animal before them had made. At least, not that we can find. Tusk, watching from whatever cognitive distance a mammoth maintains, reportedly glanced at the ochre, glanced at his own reflection in a tidal pool, then went back to eating grass with unusual focus. The long sleep. Here is what all of this actually means, and it is genuinely strange. Symbolic thought, the exact cognitive prerequisite for grasping that you, personally, will one day stop, may have evolved more than once in more than one kind of human, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles. Evolution apparently kept arriving at the same door and knocking. That is either beautiful or deeply unsettling, depending on how attached you were to the idea that our particular branch of the family invented the interior life. We did not invent it. We inherited a tendency and possibly shared it. Once symbolic minds were treating the dead with ochre and ceremony, what did that ritual behavior actually do for the living? Which is the question waiting for you in civilization's hidden engine. Here's the thing you're probably thinking. Isn't death made us build pyramids a little too neat, a little too undergraduate dorm room at 2 a.m? Fair. But the framework has a name, a serious pedigree, and data behind it. So give it a minute before you roll your eyes back into your skull. Terror management theory arrives in 1986, formulated by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, 3 psychologists who had been reading Ernest Becker's 1973 book, The Denial of Death, with the intensity of people who'd found something genuinely alarming. Becker's argument, which won him the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 1974, 2 months after he died and therefore could not enjoy it, was deceptively simple. The awareness that you will personally, certainly, stop existing is so unbearable that human civilization is largely a collective strategy for not thinking about it. Religions, monuments, empires, laws, art movements. Becker saw all of it as elaborate terror management. Tusk, for the record, finds this deeply plausible and is already making a list. The 3 psychologists turned Becker's literary argument into testable science. In controlled experiments, when you remind people of their own death, a technique researchers call mortality salience, which sounds clinical but is really just making someone think, the long sleep, then watching what they do next, they cling harder to their cultural worldview, donate more to in-group causes, and judge rule breakers more harshly. The effect is consistent across dozens of countries and hundreds of studies. It's not subtle. It's also, if you think about it, exactly what you'd expect from an animal that learned it was mortal and immediately went back to scraping a hide as fast as its hands could move. What this means for your humanity is enormous. If Becker was right, death awareness doesn't merely shadow culture like an uncomfortable houseguest. It manufactures culture, making mortality the most productive force in history. Every cathedral ceiling, every written legal code, every statue of a general on a horse, potentially the output of a species furiously outrunning a thought they caught a glimpse of in still water one afternoon around 100,000 years ago. That's not depressing. The engine was dread, and the output was everything. But is this universal? Or is the Western idea of a single traumatic moment of death, awareness itself, a cultural artifact? Which is the question that opens no single moment. So the engine was dread, and the output was everything. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is that we've been asking the wrong question entirely, and a number of people told us so long before the scientists caught up. Anthropologist Vine Deloria Jr. documented how Crow Nation oral traditions, along with many other indigenous frameworks, treat death awareness not as a switch that flipped once, but as something woven continuously into cosmological knowledge. The same way you can't point to the exact moment a river becomes the sea. There's no rupture. Death and understanding were always already the same fabric, and the question, when did humans first understand death, assumes a starting line that may never have existed. That assumption says more about us than about them. Oh, then here's why it matters. If you go looking for a single cognitive moment, you will find evidence that fits, because the past is large and patient and will confirm almost anything you bring to it with enough funding. Melvin Konner's cross-cultural survey in The Evolution of Childhood, published in 2010, found no documented human society, past or present, that lacks ritual treatment of the dead. Not one. Across thousands of cultures, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, every group of humans has done something deliberate with the people it lost. That is not the fingerprint of a rupture. That is the fingerprint of a constant. Tusk, somewhere in the deep past, catches his reflection in a still pool, freezes, thinks, the long sleep, and then immediately, furiously, goes back to scraping a hide like his life depends on it, which, in a way, is the whole model. The cosmological continuity model says death awareness isn't an event in human history. It's a condition of human history, present wherever you find us, probably present before you could cleanly call us us. The compulsion to pinpoint the rupture, to find the cave or the skull or the burial layer where it all turned on, may reveal more about the modern need for origin stories than about what actually happened in the long, unbroken business of being alive and knowing it ends. Every known human society ritualizes death without exception, and the urge may predate our species entirely, which means death awareness might not be a feature of human consciousness so much as the feature, which is exactly the pressure point examined in what that knowledge cost the creatures who carried it, in what the knowing cost us. The existential dividend. You pay something to gain something, and the brain that can picture its own death paid the highest price imaginable, and then built everything we call civilization as the receipt. Here is why it matters. Every crow buries food, every elephant nudges its dead, but only one animal sits down afterward and thinks about the sitting down, the afterward, and the eventual stopping. That recursive loop, awareness aware of itself ending, is either the greatest gift or the cruelest tax, depending on the afternoon you're having. Around 92,000 years ago, a small group of Homo sapiens at Kafse Cave in northern Israel buried their dead with red ochre, staining the bones, a deliberate act excavated by Bernard van der Meersch across decades of painstaking fieldwork in the 1960s through 1980s. Ochre on a burial means someone chose color. Choosing color means the death was framed, narrated, made into something. That is not grief alone. That is theology under construction. The word funeral itself carries the whole weight quietly. It traces through Latin funus, meaning corpse, back to a Proto-Indo-European root that may connect to smoke and burning, which means even the vocabulary of death was built around the moment the body disappears. Smoke rises. The word you use to bury someone may literally mean the going up. Language remembers things the speakers forgot they were saying. Somewhere in the back of your head, a small ancestral voice goes, "The long sleep," and then you immediately open your phone and scroll, because staying busy is load-bearing. Van der Meersch's ochre-stained bones are not a tragedy. They are a solution. The Kafse burials suggest that the moment sapiens fully grasped non-existence, they immediately began manufacturing meaning as a countermeasure, which is, if you think about it, extremely on-brand for a species that responds to every problem by making something. Death awareness is not a wound civilization slowly heals. It is the wound that made civilization necessary. And every grave, every painted god, every monument larger than any person needs to be is just the scar tissue, spread across 10,000 years of very determined coping. The existential dividend, then, is this. You receive the capacity to plan, to mourn, to make art, to build Stonehenge, to write this sentence. And the cost is that you spend your entire life knowing you will stop. No refunds. Tusk would like the record to show that this seems like a steep exchange rate. And the question it raises, whether the knowing produced the building or whether the building was always trying to outlast the knowing, is exactly where we end up next. You are crouching over your father again, hand pressed to his chest, that same cold stillness under your palm. Nothing has changed about the body, but you have changed Because somewhere between that first running and this moment, a person like you picked flowers for someone who couldn't see them anymore. That is the whole story. Awareness of death didn't make us freeze or flee forever. It made us reach for something beautiful to leave behind. So here, tens of thousands of years later, you're still running, still building, still pressing flowers into the dirt above people you loved. And the question that quietly follows you everywhere is this: if the very first thing we did with the knowledge of our own ending was make a gift, what does that tell you about everything we've made since?